but when he was younger. One thing I can promise you, that he hasn't even thought about cheating. And he takes after me like that. I was like that. But when I found the right one, that was the end. I never cheated on my wife, ever.
He said it like it was nothing. Like, cheating was just a phase Luke outgrew, the same way a boy might outgrow junk food or loud music. But the second those words came out of his mouth, he's cheated before. When he was younger, something in Meline stopped moving. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't say a word. Her silence said more than his entire defense. It wasn't the confession that shook her. It was how casually he dropped it, as if this was supposed to bring her peace. Luke's father had sat her down with the tone of a man offering wisdom, but what he handed her was a loaded memory, one she didn't even know she had to carry. And now, just days before the wedding, she had to figure out whether she was marrying a man or a pattern. Because what kind of father tells a bride-to-be that cheating doesn't count if it was before he found the right one? Is that supposed to sound romantic? Like Luke's wild phase ended the second he saw her? Meline heard it for what it was. Not reassurance, not honesty, a setup. A soft warning dressed as a fatherly anecdote. Her body sat still, but her mind raced through the timeline. If he did it before, how many details were missing? Was it one person? Was it emotional? Did he ever tell her? Or did he spin it into a story about complicated pasts and no one's perfect? Luke had always been careful with words. Smooth when he needed to be. Vague when the topic got sharp. And Meline, who had worked so hard to rebuild trust after the stripper incident, now had to ask herself if trust ever really existed at all. Or if it was something she built alone while he played along. Her fingers pressed into her lap like she was anchoring herself to the moment. She looked at Luke's father with a polite smile, the kind you give to someone who just confirmed your worst suspicion and expected applause for it. The way he smiled back told her everything. He truly thought he'd helped, that his comparison to his own past meant something. But all she heard was a pattern. He cheated. I cheated. We all cheat until we find someone worth not cheating on. And Meline? She was supposed to feel special for being the reason Luke supposedly stopped. That's not love. That's gambling. That's asking her to bet her future on a man with proven habits and a family who excuses them. She replayed his tone over and over. Calm. Casual. Almost proud. He didn't say Luke made a mistake. He said Luke takes after him. And then he leaned in like it was a compliment. That moment told her more than anything Luke ever said. Because it didn't matter what Luke promised next. His father had already written the prequel. And suddenly, Meline wasn't sure she wanted to stay for the sequel. She thought she came to marry Luke, but maybe she just walked into a generational rerun, and this time, the script was already written without her consent. He doubled down. After casually dropping that Luke used to cheat, Luke's father smiled and said, "But not anymore. He's like me. When I met my wife, that was it. Never looked at anyone else again." Meline blinked once, hard. Her forced smile began to slip, but not fast enough for him to notice. Because the man talking to her didn't come to confess, he came to sell her something. A version of Luke that had supposedly been cleaned, upgraded, husband-ready, and the way he said it, like it was supposed to be proof of growth, made her stomach clench before her mind caught up. Meline didn't need a reminder of the stripper incident. She hadn't even fully recovered from the way Luke avoided accountability then, spinning the narrative until her anger made her look irrational. And now, here was his father using his own past as a roadmap for why she should ignore the signs. As if legacy was character. As if repeating mistakes made them noble. Her instincts weren't confused. Her gut screamed. Because what she heard wasn't reassurance, it was a warning. And the worst part was, It didn't even sound malicious. That's what made it so dangerous. He believed what he was saying. He thought this was how love worked. Men stumble. Women forgive. Marriage saves. And Meline, who had spent months convincing herself she could trust again, was now being told that the pattern was tradition. A rite of passage. Luke was acting like a man ready to commit. But how ready can a man be when the foundation of his loyalty is built on fear of being left, not respect for staying? She kept nodding, because nodding was easier than explaining why this conversation was unraveling everything she had spent months holding together. Every time Luke's dad said, "He's like me," she felt her chest tighten, because that's not what she wanted. She didn't come here to repeat someone else's marriage. She wanted her own. Built on truth, not clever editing. On real safety, not temporary restraint. But his voice kept going, layering compliments over contradictions. Luke's a good man. He's made mistakes. But who hasn't? He loves you. He sacrificed so much. You should be grateful. That last one hit different. Grateful. As if marrying Luke was a favor. As if she should overlook the cracks because the house is pretty. As if men like Luke don't come around often. And when they do, you hold your tongue and hold on tight. Meline was suddenly aware that she wasn't in a conversation. She was being conditioned to see red flags as romantic, to accept confusion as compromise, to wear silence like a badge of honor. Her mind flashed to every time Luke had said, "You overthink everything." Was she? Or was this the first time she was seeing clearly? The most dangerous manipulation isn't loud. It's the kind that sounds like love while asking you to betray your own instincts. He slid it in like it was just logistics. A harmless fact. A technicality. Legally, the house is in my name, because we're not married yet. And just like that, the conversation wasn't about love anymore. It was about leverage. Meline sat back in her chair without meaning to, the way your body shifts when it realizes it's no longer safe. She didn't argue. She didn't even speak. Because that's what you do when you're still trying to calculate whether what you just heard is worse than what you feared. Luke was calm, polite, even gentle. That's what made it harder to push back. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't threatening, but he was drawing lines, clear and legal, between what was his and what wasn't hers. Meline thought they were building something together. Turns out, she was furnishing someone else's future. And now, as they planned a wedding, she was being told, subtly, but directly, that none of it was hers until she signed the papers. Not the home, not the security, not the protection she thought she already had. She asked, softly, why she couldn't be added to the deed if they were about to get married anyway. Luke smiled and said she was making things complicated. He said he'd already given everything to her emotionally, and she should stop pressuring him. That word, pressuring, landed like a slap, because asking for protection isn't pressure. It's survival. It's partnership. But Luke wanted the optics of marriage without the shared footing. She would take his name, but not his assets. She would bear his future, but not his risk. And in that moment, Meline realized this wasn't a home. It was a stage. She was the prop. He was the owner. And the script had already been written before she got a say. Every time she tried to assert her own safety, it was reframed as selfishness. Her need for financial clarity was spun as mistrust. Her desire for legal equity was labeled ungrateful. The gaslight wasn't in what he said. It was in how reasonable he made it sound. And the more calm he stayed, the more insane she felt for noticing the imbalance. Because that's how control works. It doesn't always come with raised voices or slammed doors. Sometimes It comes with contracts and calm tones and smiles that don't quite reach the eyes. Luke didn't need to threaten her. He already had the house. The paperwork. The story. She was the one trying to prove she was worthy of sharing a home she thought she already lived in. What looks like stability from the outside can be a trap when silence is the price of staying, and ownership is something you have to beg for. He looked her in the eye and said, "I've already given you everything." As if that sentence alone should end the conversation, as if love, once declared, could be used like a receipt. And suddenly, Meline wasn't a partner. She was a debtor. She was supposed to nod and smile and thank him for a generosity she never agreed was complete. She asked for legal protection. He offered emotional credit. And when she didn't accept it, the air changed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The shift was subtle but sharp. Her request became a flaw. Her concern became an accusation. His disappointment was dressed as wounded pride. This is where it got slippery. Because instead of addressing her concern, Luke framed her worry as an attack. He said she was ruining the moment, that she was too focused on technicalities, that she cared more about money than love, and she wanted to scream, but she didn't. Because he was speaking calmly, almost kindly, like a man who didn't understand why she couldn't see how much he had already done for her. That's the trick. When guilt replaces logic, you don't argue back, you doubt yourself. Meline felt it, the internal shift, the creeping thought that maybe she was being too much, that maybe asking to be on the deed, asking for clear financial protections, asking for reassurance after hearing about his past, maybe all of that did make her seem ungrateful. Maybe she really was making this about money. The gaslight didn't flicker. It burned steady, and it was warm enough to make her question whether she'd been cold all along. He smiled and said he loved her. He said he couldn't believe she was still thinking about the house. He said they were about to be one, and she was treating him like a stranger. The weapon wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. He made himself the victim of her boundaries. He made his past, cheating, a forgotten error. He made her fear look like sabotage. And in doing so, he forced her into a role she didn't agree to play. The bride who couldn't stop second-guessing a man who had already moved on. And that's how emotional control works when it's polished. It doesn't demand. It persuades. It doesn't scream. It sighs. It calls your instincts paranoia. It calls your concerns bad timing. It doesn't need force when it has the power of reframing. And Meline, who started this conversation with clarity, now found herself apologizing for ruining the mood, for being distracted, for not enjoying the ride. The most dangerous lies are the ones you start telling yourself because someone convinced you that your truth makes you difficult. She kept staring at the ring like it would start answering the questions she was too afraid to say out loud. It sparkled. It fit. It looked right. But it wasn't heavy enough to balance out what she was carrying now. Luke hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't called her names. He hadn't stormed out. That made it worse. He was calm, patient, and endlessly confusing. And somehow, all of that wrapped around her until she wasn't sure if she was reacting to the man in front of her or to the fear of looking like the woman who couldn't let go of the past. Meline wanted this to work. She wasn't pretending. She wasn't plotting. She was trying to walk forward while something inside her kept pulling her back by the spine. She had forgiven before. Or at least, she'd told herself she did. She moved past the stripper situation. She moved past the emotional, cold spells. She moved past every moment that made her pause. And now, Luke was asking her to move past one more thing. His father's confession. His silence about it. The ownership of the house. The shift in tone when she brought up her needs. And this time, she couldn't. Not fully. Not easily. Because it wasn't just one thing. It was the pattern, the way every moment of mistrust got packaged as something she needed to grow out of. Like trust was a compliment you hand over for good behavior instead of something earned and rebuilt. Luke was saying all the right things, but she realized he was only ever reacting to her discomfort, never taking responsibility for creating it. She wasn't trying to win an argument. She was trying to survive a marriage that hadn't even started yet. And now, she had to ask herself something that cut through all the noise. Can you trust someone who needs trust more than they've earned it? Because that's what he was demanding. Full faith, no conditions, no clarifications, no shared deed, no acknowledgement of the past, just a clean slate handed over by a woman who kept scrubbing out his messes and calling it love. She felt the guilt creeping in again. That voice inside her that said maybe she was being dramatic. Maybe all relationships are like this. Maybe Luke really did change. But another voice answered back louder this time. The one that reminded her of how her boundaries always became negotiations. How her forgiveness always came with a receipt. And how every time she asked for something real, she was told she should already feel safe just because he stayed. Love without safety isn't love. It's dependence dressed in pretty words. And it falls apart the moment you stop pretending doubt is disloyalty. He leaned back, arms crossed like he was giving her a life lesson. You don't understand how much Luke has sacrificed for you, he said, with that same steady tone that somehow felt more threatening than raised voices ever could. And Meline just nodded. Out of habit, not agreement. Because this wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a subtle performance. A measured statement wrapped in fatherly concern. And something about it didn't add up. Not just the words. Those were expected. But the timing. The way it was all landing in the exact moment when she was most unsure, most vulnerable, most close to walking away. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't warning her outright. But that's what made it feel rehearsed. Like he'd been waiting for the perfect moment to drop this particular guilt bomb. Why now? Why tell her Luke cheated in the past, then immediately follow it up with how much she should appreciate him? Why build the narrative that Luke was the one giving up everything, as if Meline brought nothing to the table but her expectations? The story he was crafting wasn't neutral. It was deliberate. Luke's past was rebranded as sacrifice. Meline's caution was recast as ingratitude. And in between, the wedding plans stayed intact. At least for now. Meline started asking the question silently. Was this sabotage in disguise? Was he trying to push her out by making her feel unwelcome? Like she'd never be good enough for the son he pretended to compare to himself? Or was it worse? Was he trying to trap her in place by cornering her with guilt? Either way, it wasn't support. It was pressure, calculated and smooth. No one had raised their voice. But somehow, she felt like she was being shoved. She wanted to ask him, straight out, why now? Why this conversation, at this moment, when it's too late to walk away without blowing up everything? But she already knew the answer. Because this is when people are least likely to walk away. Right before the wedding, after the dresses are picked, the deposits are made, the promises already half whispered to family and friends. He didn't need to scare her off. He just needed to weaken her resolve enough that she wouldn't leave, even if she wanted to. The message wasn't hidden. It was just polite. Be grateful. Take the man. Accept the past. Sign the marriage. Make peace with the control. Smile through the silence. And Meline, sitting in someone else's house, realizing she owned none of it, not the narrative, not the protection, not even the decision to pause, felt something snap inside. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. This wasn't about love. This was about positioning, ownership, winning. Luke's father wasn't trying to keep them together. He was trying to make sure she entered the marriage knowing exactly where she stood. One step behind, one word away from being labeled the ungrateful bride who ruined everything. Sometimes the biggest red flag isn't what they say, it's when they choose to say it and who benefits from your silence. She sat alone, staring at the ring like it belonged to someone else. It still fit her finger, but it didn't feel like it was hers anymore. Not after that conversation. Not after the quiet corrections she kept swallowing to keep the peace. Everyone around her was talking about flowers, schedules, hair trials, and vows. But all she could see was a version of the wedding where she smiled through clenched teeth and said I do to a setup she never designed. Her name wasn't on the house. Her concerns had been reframed as complaints. Her boundaries were labeled as distrust. And now, her voice? Too disruptive. Too sharp. Too emotional. Too much. Luke hadn't changed the subject. He'd buried it. He called her overwhelmed when she tried to express fear. He called her nervous when she brought up legal rights. He said she was stressing herself out when she asked again why she couldn't be included on the deed. And maybe he believed those things. Maybe he truly thought her discomfort was just wedding jitters. But that's the problem, isn't it? When a man only hears your fears as a phase to wait out, not a truth to sit with. Meline began to understand that silence was the price of staying in the story he wanted to tell. She pictured herself walking down the aisle, and something twisted in her chest. Not because she didn't love him, but because she couldn't find a version of that day where her needs were taken seriously. She saw herself in the dress. She saw the guests. She saw the vows. But what she didn't see was safety. She didn't see a shared future, just a shared ceremony. The home they picked was already legally his. The family already saw her as someone who should be grateful. And every time she asked a real question, the air turned cold. Not cruel. Controlled. Control is harder to fight when it's soft. When it sounds like love. When it uses calm tones and wedding deadlines to shape your decisions. It's not a fight. It's a slow erasure. It's being talked over with a smile. It's being told you're loved while your place is quietly being negotiated without your input. And Meline was starting to see it for what it was. This wasn't a partnership. It was a contract. And she wasn't signing up for a life. They were just assigning her a role. What do you call a marriage where one person gets the house, the benefit of the doubt, and the final word, and the other gets the silence in between? The house was quiet, but her head wasn't. There were no raised voices, no footsteps, no one calling her name. Just that sharp stillness where even the air felt like it was holding back. Meline sat on the edge of the bed, not crying, not moving. Her hands were folded, but not calm. Her fingers pressed into each other like they were trying to stay grounded in a moment that kept slipping. No noise, no chaos. Just that creeping awareness that she might be alone in this, even when surrounded by people who say they love her. She replayed the conversations again, the father's subtle dismissal, Luke's calm deflections, the way concern turned into guilt without anyone ever raising their voice. No one called her wrong. They didn't need to. They just kept reacting like her instincts were interruptions. And now that she was finally alone with her thoughts, it all came rushing in at once. She had asked simple questions, logical ones, about fairness, about safety, about being seen. And somehow, every answer had left her more confused than the one before it. She kept thinking, maybe she was overreacting. Maybe this is how all brides feel before a wedding. Maybe this knot in her stomach is just nerves. But underneath that thought was another voice, quieter, sharper. The one that had been growing louder since Luke said the house was already taken care of, since his father compared cheating to a phase, since her own worry was reframed as ruining the moment. That voice said, You know what this is. And you know it's not new. This wasn't a meltdown. This wasn't drama. It was the kind of quiet fear that settles in your body before you even give it a name. The kind that makes your chest feel full and hollow at the same time. Because now, it wasn't just about whether she wanted to marry Luke. It was about whether she even knew who she was in this relationship anymore. Whether she'd been slowly edited out of the partnership one conversation at a time. And that was the worst part. Not the house. Not the past cheating. Not the pressure. It was the loneliness. The realization that every time she tried to explain herself, the person who said they loved her made her feel like she was the problem. It wasn't screaming, it wasn't betrayal, it was dismissal. And that kind of rejection, the quiet, subtle kind, stays with you longer than any fight ever could. Silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it's where doubt grows strongest, especially when no one's left to argue but you. She kept looking at the dress hanging on the door like it belonged to someone braver. The fabric was clean, untouched, flawless. It hadn't seen the weight of decisions made in silence. It hadn't listened to half answers disguised as reassurances. It hadn't been in the room when Meline sat across from a man who loved her, only when she didn't ask for anything that made him uncomfortable. That dress had no idea what kind of marriage it was walking into. And now, Meline was starting to wonder if she did either. What does I do even mean when so much of what you're agreeing to was never clearly stated? When half the promises were implied, and the other half come with terms you were never allowed to edit? She wasn't saying yes to a shared life. She was saying yes to a setup, a home she didn't own, a man who called trust pressure, a family who praised loyalty while offering none to her voice. The vows were supposed to be sacred. But for her, they already felt like a surrender. Luke wanted a wife who moved on, who forgave by forgetting, who protected him by pretending. And Meline was expected to call that strength. She was supposed to stand at the altar and speak as if none of this felt one-sided. As if love could survive inside a dynamic where asking questions made you unstable, where legal clarity made you transactional, where fear was a sign of weakness, not intuition. And the more she tried to rationalize it, the more obvious it became. This wasn't just about love. It was about control. Was she marrying Luke? Or the version of him that everyone kept insisting was good enough to ignore the red flags? Was she building a future? Or performing one that was already designed without her consent? Marriage was supposed to be a partnership, but everything leading up to it had been a lesson in power. Who holds it? Who denies it? And who's left apologizing for noticing it at all? She kept trying to visualize the ceremony, the music, the faces, the promises, but it kept cutting to black right before the kiss. Not because she didn't love him, but because she no longer trusted the foundation beneath them. If everything felt this uncertain now, what would change after vows were exchanged? Would her voice matter more? Or would it disappear completely? Sometimes the hardest part of saying yes isn't the commitment. It's realizing the terms were written before you ever had a chance to read them. The next morning, everything looked the same. The ring was still on her finger. The date was still set. The checklist still sat on the counter with little boxes waiting to be marked. But something was gone, and she knew it the second she opened her eyes. Her certainty had left the room. The blind loyalty she once wore like armor had dissolved into quiet calculation. She hadn't run. She hadn't canceled. She hadn't even told Luke what his father's words had done to her. Because she knew exactly how that conversation would go. He'd nod, say he understood, then reroute the discomfort back onto her shoulders like always. So she did nothing. Not because she was okay, but because she was out of new ways to explain why she wasn't. She moved through the day like a woman in costume, answering messages, reviewing final details, smiling When someone said, "It's almost here," like she wasn't wondering if the worst mistake she could make was showing up. But she still planned to show up, not because she believed this was right, but because when you've spent months telling everyone you're sure, it becomes harder to admit when you're not. Doubt grows loud in silence, but it whispers in public. And Meline had learned how to swallow it without choking. She didn't feel peace. She felt pace. Like if she stayed in motion, she wouldn't have to sit with how little she recognized herself anymore. Every part of this wedding had been touched by someone else's hands. His father's, even her own when she bent to fit into a mold she no longer believed in. But instead of screaming or leaving, she just pulled the zipper on her dress all the way up and stared into the mirror with the blankness of someone who knows exactly what she's walking into. She would walk down that aisle, but she wouldn't walk as the same woman who had said yes to the ring. That version of her, the one who believed every soft word, who made excuses for silence, who thought love was enough to outweigh a pattern, was gone. Not dead, just done. What was left was someone colder, quieter, still in love, but no longer naive enough to confuse that with safety. And that's the thing no one tells you. Weddings don't need full trust to proceed. They only need momentum. And if you look close enough, behind every smiling bride, there's often a shadow of a woman wondering if she missed the last exit before the ceremony. Meline wasn't running. She wasn't sabotaging. But something inside her had stopped hoping. And it wouldn't come back. Not even if the flowers were perfect. Not even if Luke looked at her like he meant every word. Sometimes, the vows still happen. The photos still come out perfect. But the version of you who believed in forever? She doesn't make it to the altar. And if you think the silence at the altar was bad, wait until you see what Luke does after the vows, when the cameras stop rolling and the real contract begins.